games, this game was particularly special for the use of CG graphics in a 2D 16-bit game. This became the character Donkey Kong's first step into 3D graphics, although not in the most traditional sense. In this episode of Low Poly, we're gonna check out just how far Diddy and Donkey Kong's models have come since the original Donkey Kong Country, and we're gonna check out just how much they've changed within the main series. There are also some boundaries to be broken in Donkey Kong Country Returns with Shesez, and we'll be checking out the development story of Donkey Kong Country Returns with my good friend Beta64. Welcome to this action-packed episode of Low Poly. Now first off, let's take a look at the 3D models that were actually used to make Diddy and Donkey's sprites in Donkey Kong Country. Now in terms of polygon count, I actually have no idea as these models are not available to the public. What I can tell you about these models is they're actually made using NURBS and not polygons. NURBS stands for Non-Uniform Rational Basis Spline, and it's basically just another way of representing curves and surfaces. If we check out the wireframe for these models as seen in this promotional material, we can see that the models are probably pretty high in poly count, particularly for the time that these were made. I guess an estimate would be anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 polygons, but that really is a wild stab in the dark. These models would then be procedurally textured, and then would come the biggest challenge of all, turning these pre-rendered graphics into 16-bit sprites used in the game. These pre-rendered animations you can see would contain millions of colors, which would then have to be boiled down to a sprite that contains just 16 colors. Also, animating with 3D models meant that animations were smooth and fluid, but had way too many frames of animation that would eventually be cut just so animations didn't last way too long. For 1994, the techniques used to make the sprites in Donkey Kong Country was certainly impressive. Seriously, it'd be really cool to get my hands on these models so we could look at them in detail, but unfortunately, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. However, it does get me thinking, what would the full game have looked like if we didn't limit the palette to just 16 colors? Well, I can tell you it wouldn't have looked like Donkey Kong 64. Now this model of Donkey Kong is 702 tries. The design of the model stays pretty faithful to the original design from Donkey Kong Country, although it's a little less refined. But it definitely manages to capture Donkey Kong's very strong silhouette, making it a great resemblance. Donkey's huge ape hands turn out to be giant shovels as they're just one big mesh. Naturally, as is the case with most N64 games, the details are in the texture. They even went as far as to detail the inside of Donkey Kong's mouth, which is kind of cool, I guess. However, they get a full 10 points for modeling Donkey Kong's butt. It's amazing what a handful of tries can do. Let's move on to Diddy Kong's model from Donkey Kong 64, and I have to say, straight up, I don't like this model. With limitations and all that in mind, it kinda looks like a knockoff version of a real Diddy Kong. It's kinda like the fake version of real toys that exist and the kind of knockoff version that's called like Super Donkey Diddy Kong or something ridiculous like that. It has to be something to do with the face. The face is just off for me. Anyway, this model is 678 tries, so only about 20 or so tries less than Donkey Kong's model. I don't know, I just remember this model looking way better in the actual game, but that could be down to the resolution the game plays at. Either way, I don't think I can look at this one any longer. Ugh. Let's move on to a different Diddy Kong from Diddy Kong Racing. Now this Diddy is the lowest poly of the bunch at 344 tries, which makes sense as this is a racing game, so they tend to have lower poly character models just to make everything run smoothly. Now fans of the game will recognize this model of Diddy is actually from the character select screen, hence why he's holding up a sign with the number 1 on it. This is a really cute model of Diddy Kong, and I feel it's way closer to the character than the one used in Donkey Kong 64. The textures naturally are super low resolution, but that's to be expected. The wireframe for the model reveals just how low poly it really is and how much detail they were able to compact into such a low poly model. Okay, let's move back to the main series now, and this model of Donkey Kong from Donkey Kong Country Returns. Now this Donkey Kong is 4,310 tries and is beautifully designed to look exactly like the original character design from Donkey Kong Country. Now with this being a Wii game, the textures are quite low res, but you'd never see them close up, so you'd never be able to tell. You'll also see a separate model of Donkey Kong's eyelids, which would obviously be used whenever Donkey Kong blinks. Obviously, with higher poly count comes better detail. Donkey Kong now has individual fingers and not the giant ape shovels that he had in Donkey Kong 64. Again, this model perfectly captures that strong silhouette that Donkey Kong has always had with that kind of hair at the top of his head, instantly recognizable. And of course, there's more geometry in Donkey's face now, which opens up the possibility of a more expressive character model. And of course, we now have a more detailed donkey butt. It sure is hairy. Let's take a look at Diddy Kong from Donkey Kong Country Returns, and again, this is another beautifully crafted model. At 3,516 tries, we now have a much cuter version of Diddy Kong, which is a lot closer to the original design from Donkey Kong Country, unlike the bargain basement version from Donkey Kong 64. Just like Donkey Kong, Diddy has two separate versions of eyelids this time round, one for angry eyes and one for just blinking, I guess. Of course, for those who have played Donkey Kong Country Returns, you may remember that Diddy Kong uses these two sets of guns and he has a jetpack. If we add this gear to Diddy's base model, it now becomes 5,452 tries, which is a significant bump in poly count. But I have to say, I love the gear that they give him in this game. It's so beautifully modeled and textured. The textures are very stylized, but also low resolution because it's on the Wii. Now, Donkey Kong Country Returns happens to be one of my favorite of the main series, and I want to explore some of the world of Donkey Kong Country Returns in more detail. And who better to help me out than Shesez of Boundary Break? Take it away, Shesez.
Okay, so the first thing I gotta show you guys is, of course, what is Donkey Kong playing on his Nintendo DS? And as you can see, it's just two blank screens. I mean, I'm not too surprised by that. He's an ape, folks. What did you expect? But it is pretty impressive to see that they even bothered to texture the inside of the DS. Next up is Cranky Kong's house. Now, it's always fun to just see things from a different perspective when there's only one camera coordinate for it, but there's something a little more special to Cranky's house than just that. Outside of the house, you can see two skyboxes, one that is used and one that is unused. The one that is used is very specifically designed to show you only the amount of texture that is even necessary to look through the window. And for some reason, it overextends with a whole bunch of blank blue. But behind that is a regular skybox, probably intended to be used originally, but then the developers decided against it. In fact, the motivation behind that would be pretty obvious. Every single new area you go to Cranky's hut in, there's a new backdrop for every single one. Now we gotta do a zoom out of the overworld map, and there's two levels of detail for this overworld map. There's one where you're zoomed in on the land that you're actually playing on, and unbeknownst to the player, all the environment in the other areas are completely culled out. However, when you zoom the map out to show the entire island, now all the environments are a lower quality render. Like for example, these locked chains over here were once fully modeled, and now they're swapped out for 2D textures. So what does it look like when we zoom the camera out on an actual stage? Well, unfortunately, it works a lot like Crash Bandicoot, where since the camera is so controlled, the developers are able to get away with drawing in portions of the environment depending on where the character's position is. And as a result, you see a lot of the map missing, as well as a lot of environment on certain pathways completely gone because they can use a liberal amount of culling and draw scripting. But just for fun, we're gonna go off into the background here and look at Tiki Tong, because way back here you can see that he's just a 2D texture. Probably something you could have noticed on your own if you squinted really hard. But seeing just how much detail they put into this texture up close and personal is kind of fun. And that's all I got. Thanks so much for having me on A+Start. Huge honor.
Well, it was really cool to see some stuff that I couldn't show the audience, so thanks for joining in, man. And on that note, there's some other things I really want to share about this game, but I'm gonna leave this up to my good friend Beta64 to give you some insides and outsides on this game.
Let's get started with some beta stuff. Basically, we're going to be looking through a few pieces of early footage showcasing Donkey Kong Country Returns while it was still in development, so we can see what kind of changes were made to the game before release. We'll start by checking out the Donkey Kong Country Returns debut demo footage, which shows off quite a few changes, especially to the title screen. The most obvious change is definitely the fact that the entire background is different. Those cool little rock formations from the debut footage were cut from the final title screen. That button combo text color was obviously changed too, but something that might not be so obvious is those spears in the background. Turns out they went through a weight loss program and got thinner. Taibo really works, ladies and gentlemen. That alone is the proof. Moving on to some actual gameplay in this demo, it seems that throughout all of it, those helpful pig dudes are completely missing. I have a feeling that this change was just for the demo trailer though, since they do appear in a bunch of other footage we'll look at later. The most interesting difference in this footage though, at least in my opinion, is how the stage is shown during sunset in the early footage. But in the final, it's midday all the time, no sun to be seen. A shame, because this stage honestly looks a lot prettier in the debut demo. Now let's head to E3 2010, where we get to see an official E3 trailer of the game. This is where a bulk of the differences lie. First being the HUD, which if you've watched any of my other videos, is usually what I start with because it changes a lot between the early versions and the final games. Here in DKCR, you can see that the banana counter font is completely different, both font and color wise. And not to mention, the background color of the portrait when you've got both Diddy Kong and Donkey Kong became a darker blue throughout development. Plus, it also seems that the background and the hearts are shinier between the builds. Let's zoom out. Now look at that spiky Froggo beast. Despite the design of the boss not really changing, the effects when defeating it went from like,
"Oh, you got me,"
to
fatality.
Also throughout this trailer, when the player picks up a nanner, the animation is super different and not nearly as polished as what we saw later. Oh, and by the by, the donkey eating death flowers below, those changed between this trailer and the final release. Turns out, not only did we get a nice trailer at E3 2010, but we also got a playable demo too, which means more detailed footage. Yes, beautiful, blurry, shaky, overexposed off-screen footage. 1 second. There we go. That's a bit better. Okay, this demo is specifically for level 1-1 in the final game and showcases a few interesting changes, like how enemies literally couldn't care less of a crap that you're there in the demo. No matter how close you get to them, they just keep trouncing forward until you end their life in a little puff of smoke. In the final, they do actually do something if they see you. They'll jump up and then start running full speed ahead. At least as much as you can with those little legs. They're trying so hard.
Thank you, Beta64. Let's take a look at our final set of models from Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Now these two models of Donkey and Diddy are the highest poly of the main series. Donkey Kong's model comes in at 8,892 tries, which is double the poly count he was in Donkey Kong Country Returns. Obviously, with this being a Wii U game, they could allow that kind of poly count and everything would still run smoothly. It's not just the poly count that's doubled, also the resolution of the textures seems to be higher as well. Pretty standard really, better hardware means better textures. This is basically just a much higher resolution, better version of the one from Donkey Kong Country Returns. Donkey also has his separate eyelid models, but also there's one extra model that we didn't see with Donkey Kong Country Returns, and that's this 3DS. In Tropical Freeze, if you leave Donkey idle long enough, he'll pull out his 3DS and start playing it. However, you never actually get to see if Donkey Kong's playing anything, so let's take an up-close look, and the answer to that is no, he's not. This is easily the best looking Donkey Kong model of the entire main series. But it's not the highest poly version, but to look at those, we'd have to look at something like Mario Kart or the Smash Brothers games, which we'll take a look at in a separate episode. Before we end this episode, we of course have to look at Diddy Kong's model from Tropical Freeze. This model of Diddy is 8,004 tries, which again is double the poly count of his model in Donkey Kong Country Returns. And of course, like Donkey's model, the resolution of the textures is bumped up too. With Diddy's jetpack and guns, the entire model comes to 13,522 tries, which I might add is now nearly 3 times the poly count of Donkey Kong Country Returns. The guns and jetpack appear to be an entirely new model with way better textures and a lot more detail. You'll also see that Diddy has 2 separate eyelid models, but also this time around he has these separate pupils which add extra levels of expression to his eyes. Not too much more to say about this model, it's just a much nicer, much higher poly, better detail, better textured version of Diddy Kong, and it's probably the definitive version of him from the entire main series. But that about wraps it up for Donkey and Diddy Kong's journey in this episode of Low Poly from their very first game, Donkey Kong Country Returns, all the way up to Tropical Freeze. I want to thank Shesez and Beta64 for helping me out in this episode. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out me on their channels where we also talk more about Donkey Kong Country glitches, development stories, and a bit of boundary breaking. So check out all their episodes, and I guess I'll see you there. You can follow me on Twitter or Instagram, and as always, a huge thanks to everybody who supports the Patreon. You guys are the ones that make it happen.